This is Rewind with Jimmy Hyams on Full Disclosure, and we're interviewing a lot of sports personalities in East Tennessee, and we're pleased now to be joined by the former commissioner of the SEC, Roy Kramer. Mr. Kramer, how are you doing?
Doing pretty good for an old man.
Well, it's good to see you. I want to take you back to your days as the commissioner of the SEC, and when you were hired, within 7 months, the SEC expanded. You added Arkansas, you added South Carolina. When you became the commissioner, was that inevitable?
Well, the presidents had talked about it for a while. At our June meeting in Destin was that we would make an announcement that we were considering expansion. Mm-hmm. They were very specific. We were not to call anybody. They didn't want us to invite people. They didn't want other conferences to be upset because we were calling people and so forth, which was good. And we proceeded in that manner. We announced that we were going to look at the landscape and that we would see if there were any institutions interested in joining our conference and that we would consider them along the way. We didn't say we were going to expand, but we indicated we were considering. Within a week, we heard from several schools. Obviously, Arkansas was probably the first one. And obviously, South Carolina. We had discussions with some other schools at that time. However, both Arkansas and South Carolina indicated a very serious interest at that point. And so we moved forward with that. We met with Arkansas first. Frank Broyles was the athletic director at Arkansas that time and was a very strong figure in intercollegiate athletics, as you know, and indicated they were seriously interested. And so we agreed to meet with their president, Frank, and their faculty representative. This was supposed to be all undercover. And we met at an airport outside of Memphis, at the airport out there, at a motel. And I'll never forget, Womack went with me, Mark, and we got to the airport, and Mark handed me the morning copy of USA Today, in which there was an interview with Broyles, indicating they had interviewed him because they'd heard these rumors. Frank gave this big, long story about how they had been a lifelong member of the Southwest Conference and they'd been a loyal member, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Didn't exactly say they were going to stay, but he gave every indication that they were going to be a part of the Southwest Conference. Well, we walk into the motel in Memphis, and first thing, we walked into the lobby and there were television cameras all over. This is in the old days when they had those big long cables and all of that stuff. You know, you could hardly walk through the lobby. Right. And I said, dang, Broyles, he's told everybody all this already. Well, we found out that wasn't the case. They were having a contest for the Miss Northern Mississippi candidate for the Miss America contest or something. It had nothing to do with us. Yeah, okay. And nobody even knew who we were. Yeah. So we walked into the room, and pretty soon Broyles and his entourage walked in, and I threw that paper over to Frank. I said, Frank, why are we here? Oh, he says, don't pay any attention to that. I had to say something. He says, where do we sign?
He was ready.
Yeah, he was ready. And we had a fairly good discussion, talked about all of the issues. The things that, you know, they came in as an equal member. There were no special deals for anybody. We had several schools were interested in coming in if they could get a special deal. Our president says there were not going to be any special deals for anybody. And indicated they wanted to do it as quickly as possible. And I think we made the announcement within 10 days after that for Arkansas. South Carolina took a little longer. In the meantime, we talked to several other schools, but none who were really sure yet whether they wanted to consider it or not. And South Carolina called that they'd had a private meeting of their board of trustees that afternoon, and that they had voted to join the conference. If we accept, I called our presidents. They were very supportive of South Carolina. One of the things that was very significant in our considerations was the institutions had similar programs. They had to have a full program of women's athletics. They had to have a full program of men's athletics. They had a broad-based program. They had to have a strong fan base. They had to have they basically were to be similar institutions to the institutions that were already in the Southeastern Conference. And certainly South Carolina met that. So I called our presidents. We had a conference call, and they voted unanimously to take South Carolina. And I called their president at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and told them that we had accepted their membership. And I said, when do you want to make this announcement? He said, well, we'd like to make it at 7 o'clock tonight. And this was 4:30 or something in the afternoon. And I said, we were in Birmingham, and I said, well, we'll work on that. So we chartered a private plane, and 3 or 4 of us from the conference office flew to Columbia, and we made the announcement in their stadium, in the outside of their stadium. That night, it was a little later. I think we finally made it about 8 o'clock. It was a beautiful night, full moon, and made the announcement for South Carolina to come in at that time.
Why was the SEC interested in expanding? Was it to have a football playoff?
Never was a part of the discussion.
Okay.
The playoff was never a part of the discussion. They just felt that the 12-team, balanced 12-team would give us a broader coverage in the southeastern part of the country, that it had some advantages to us as far as marketing. Although when you look at it, we really didn't do it for television because, not being disrespectful, but there's more television sets in probably Cleveland, Ohio than there is in Arkansas all put together. So it wasn't like we were bringing in major. Now, other conferences did this. I'll say this. Obviously, brought institutions in to broaden their television market. But there's a general feeling that this would give us a sort of a shot in the arm and give us a different look at things. And the presidents thought, well, let's look at it. I don't think they were really ready to do it as quickly as it happened, but they wanted to take a look at it, and it moved forward from there.
I remember Harvey Schiller, the commissioner before you were the commissioner.
He was there when they started talking about it.
Right. And I remember Texas A&M, Florida State, Miami were schools that he talked about.
Yeah.
Did any of those 4 schools call the SEC to express interest in joining the league?
A couple did. Miami and Florida State. We never talked to Texas or Oklahoma. Never talked to any of those people or Texas A&M. None of them called. In the media at that time, there was a general consensus that Florida State would be one of those schools. They had an interest, but not what I would call a really strong interest. I think part of that was Coach Bowden. Coach Bowden had great success. He'd won 2 or 3 national championships. He was sort of the king on the mountain without having to play that Southeastern Conference schedule.
Yeah.
And I could see why. We met, and I talked with Bobby for 2 or 3, 4 hours. Bobby was a great friend. I don't know that the rest of their administration was overly interested. I think they would do it. Coach Bowden was very strong at that time. He was. Florida State sort of reacted to what Coach Bowden wanted to do at that time because he'd won those. He was very successful. Miami didn't meet at that time what our presidents were looking for in the broad-based program and all of the kinds of things that we were looking at that time, and they never got to a very serious level of discussion there. Arkansas and South Carolina sort of stood out from the beginning. I mean, it was obvious they were looking. South Carolina was independent, as you know, at the time. Arkansas was unique because they were the only non-Texas school in the Southwest Conference. Now, Frank and Darrell Royal were the greatest friends that ever came down the road. They were great friends. But Frank always felt they were in second place because all the rest of the conference was centered in Texas and so forth. So there was kind of a leaning there. And of course, Frank had some Southeastern college. He went to Georgia Tech. He had some Southeastern ties, so to speak. But I think it was more the fact that they were in a conference where they were the lone non-Texas school in it.
So the SEC expands to 12 teams. That allows you to have a conference football championship.
And we were aware of that. I'm not saying that we weren't aware of it, but I don't think it was a dominating thing at that point.
Did it become more successful than you ever envisioned?
Probably, although in this part of the country where college football was so strong, fan base wise and otherwise, I could not see how it would not succeed and add interest to it. The rule, which a lot of people weren't totally aware of, Frank, I'll never forget Steve Spurrier, when we talked to him, he says, is that legal? And the rule was originally put in for Division II and Division III because nobody in Division I at that time had 12 schools. So, but the rule was put in, and it was non-divisional, so to speak, because it simply stated that a conference that had 12 or more schools, so that they couldn't play a full round robin schedule at that time because we only played 11 games at that time, could petition to have a championship game at the end of the season. So the rule was there, and it was perfectly. Now, when we first announced it, there was a lot of reaction by other conferences across the country. Some of them even considered introducing legislation in the NCAA that was illegal in Division I to have a championship game, and it was not a well-accepted idea by our fellow conferences. But the interesting part, within a couple of years, all of them had a conference championship game. And the first game, we had a great first game, as you remember. First two games were played in Birmingham. And the first one between Florida and Alabama went right down to the wire. In fact, I was almost convinced that we were going into overtime, and the new overtime had just come in, the rule and so forth. So I was on my way down the field to confer with our officials and so forth. But anyway, it went right down to the wire. In fact, Alabama intercepted a pass right toward the end of the game that sealed it for Alabama. Alabama at the time was rated number one in the country. And that was one of the great discussions by our coaches, was the fact that playing this extra game would result in the fact that the Southeastern Conference would never win another national championship.
Pat Dye said that. Auburn's coach, he said, the SEC will never win another championship doing this.
Yeah, Pat said that very strongly.
And by the way, Alabama the first year won the national championship. But were you a little bit uneasy?
There were a lot of people, well, the media was big into that idea. Here that, and I'll never forget Gene Stoller. Gene says, we won 11 games and we haven't won anything. He wasn't vehement opposed, but I know this. He says, geez, we've won 11 games and haven't won a thing. He says, this doesn't make sense. And so there was, I think if you'd have taken a vote of our coaches at that time, you would not have gotten a favorable vote for the playoff. The thing that I was concerned about a little bit is that we had played in a 10-conference background for so long that it would take time for fans to adjust, which will be interesting to see what happens now as we go on to some 16 teams. And you don't have the full divisional play any longer, how that works out. But what did occur was that we found out that late in the season we had as many in some years as 6 or 7 teams with an opportunity to get into the conference championships, which made some late season games, which normally weren't meaningful at all in those days because they'd already decided who the champion was, become very important games. And it extended the interest, I felt, considerably in the late season games, where in other years those might not have been in discussion at all. And of course, the first game, it was extremely successful. It was unique. The commissioner of the NFL came. Keith Jackson did the game, if you remember, in Birmingham, and it was very dramatic and so forth. And at that time, had the highest rating of any college football game up to that point in time. Of course, it's past now, but because it was so unique.
Did the popularity of conference championships lead to the BCS?
What it did, it raised the interest in that postseason event. Mm-hmm. And as time passed, I wouldn't say the first year, but 2 or 3 years passed, if it's possible for a conference to create that kind of an atmosphere, why don't we try to create it on the national level? There was a drive toward the BCS more so, however, in the fact that as more and more of the independent institutions like Florida State, Penn State, a lot of Syracuse, Notre Dame were the only teams you ended up by inviting to a major bowl, because otherwise you were playing the second place team out of another conference, because everybody had a bowl agreement. We had the agreement with the Sugar Bowl, the Big Ten and Pac-10 had the agreement with the Rose Bowl. Everybody had a tie-in, so that we were finding ourselves looking at playing second place teams out of other conferences, which reduced the interest in the Sugar Bowl or those, and to find a way to better match teams at the end of the year to get a better interest in it from the fan base and broader coverage. And that drove the idea of looking at something nationally. ABC had an interest in this. This was long before ESPN was so dominant as it is today. Dennis Swanson, who was their chairman, and Tony Petitti, and we met in the bowels, as they said, of the old Georgia Dome before our championship game, and they had talked about it. And one of the things that was driving it was the fact that they were getting ready to renew the Rose Bowl.
Yeah.
But they were looking ahead and were going to try to use that negotiation to possibly put this concept together if we had some interest. And we talked to all of our other conferences, and by and large there was interest. I wouldn't say there's support. The biggest hurdle he had was the Rose Bowl. The Rose Bowl was such a traditional game, had such a strong interest. And for the Pac-10 and the Big Ten to begin to look at it. But I'll say this, Jim Delaney in particular was rather supportive from the very beginning, at least to look at it. He was very open-minded at it. The Rose Bowl was very traditional. Mm-hmm. The first time I met with their committee, Dennis Swanson called me up and asked me to go out and speak to their committee and bring up the idea, because he didn't want to do it. He was negotiating with them. Yeah. So I went to out and met in their offices out in Pasadena, and they had a very big committee. I don't know how large it was. Very influential men in Los Angeles and so forth. And Herman Kronk was the chairman. He invited me, and so I went out and made a big presentation about how great the BCS would be. It did even increase the interest in the Rose Bowl and so forth. And when I finished, Herman says, "Well, gentlemen, are there any questions for Mr. Kramer?" Not one single question. I mean, you could have heard a pin drop. It was the end of it. So I said, well, this is a great idea. I found out how traditional, the Rose Bowl parade turned at the same corner on the same street for 75 years, and they weren't about to change. So that didn't go over very well. But Harriman and I kind of had a relationship. We talked quite a bit. And finally, we met 2 or 3 more times. Finally, met a time in Dallas. And finally, they agreed to be a part of it and so forth. And the biggest fear they had, and I understood that, is that in some given year, the Big Ten team might be ranked number 1 and the Pac-10 might be ranked number 2. And both of them would be playing in the Orange Bowl, which was their game being played in the Orange Bowl. Right. That was what was the Well, I went back and studied history, and only once in the past 50 years at that time had a team from the Big Ten and a team from the Pac-10 been rated 1 and 2. So I told him, it's only happened once in 50 years. You don't have to worry about it. So the strange part was the first year we got down to we got down to the championship game weekend, and we had 3 teams. We had Michigan, UCLA, and it was the third.
Kansas State.
Yeah, Kansas State. Mm-hmm. We're all rated at the top, and it looked like it that 1 and 2 were going to end up as Michigan UCLA. And I'll never forget, Cameron called me about Burnett. He says, Roy, you told me this wasn't going to happen. I said, Herman, I told you it's only happened once in 50 years. So if it happens the first year, you don't have to worry about it for the next 49. That didn't go over very well either. But of course, it turned out that all of them got knocked out of it, and Tennessee and Florida State ended up playing in the game.
When we come back with part 2 with Commissioner Roy Kramer, we'll talk about his career and also some current events with expansion, with NIL, and with the transfer portal.